The rain had been falling for 37 days when the knight appeared at the edge of the sepulchre lines. Brother Matthias first saw him through the periscope mounted above the fire base, a dark figure astride a charger that seemed to breathe steam rather than mist. The knight's armor caught what little light filtered through the perpetual overcast. Each plate polished to mirror brightness despite the mud and filth that coated everything else in this cursed stretch of no man's land. Matthias blinked and adjusted the scope. The figure remained, motionless as a statue, lance held upright against the gray sky. The weapon itself seemed wrong somehow, its tip crowned with what looked like molten wax that dripped steadily yet never diminished. Each droplet hissed as it struck the sodden earth, sending up wisps of acrid smoke. "Sergeant Kovac," Matthias called down into the trench, his voice barely audible above the constant drumming of rain on corrugated metal. "We have a visitor." Kovac hauled himself up the ladder, his boots squelching in, the ankle-deep mixture of mud and worse things that lined the bottom of their position. The sergeant had been fighting in these trenches for 3 years, since the great push toward New Antioch had stalled and calcified into this eternal siege. His face bore the gray pallor of a man who had breathed too much cordite and seen too many friends buried in the black soil. "Where?" Kovac squinted through the rain. 200 yards, bearing north, northwest. Mounted figure, heavy armor. Kovac took the periscope and spent long minutes studying the apparition. The knight's horse stood perfectly still, its flanks unmarked by the shrapnel that had torn through this ground for months. Steam rose from its nostrils in regular puffs, but there was something mechanical about the rhythm, as if the beast were a clockwork thing rather than living flesh. "Heretic patrol?" Kovac muttered. "No banner, no unit markings I can see. Could be one of ours then, messenger from command." But even as he spoke, Kovac knew that wasn't right. No messenger would ride alone across the killing fields, and no horse would stand so calmly in range of enemy snipers. The knight's armor gleamed with an inner light that seemed to emanate from within the metal itself, and now that Kovac looked more carefully, he could see that the plates were not merely polished but covered in intricate engravings that seemed to shift and writhe in the uncertain light. "Look at his chest," Matthias whispered. Kovac adjusted the focus. The knight's breastplate was adorned with what appeared to be trophy scales, each one the size of a dinner plate and riveted directly to the armor. But as Kovac watched, the scales began to pulse with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. The metal surfaces rippled like water, and beneath them something seemed to be moving. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Kovac breathed. The knight's head turned toward their position with mechanical precision. Even at this distance, Kovac could see the glow of eyes within the helmet's visor. The knight raised his lance in what might have been a salute, and the molten wax at its tip flared brighter, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Then the knight spurred his mount forward. The horse moved with unnatural grace across the torn ground, its hooves finding purchase on surfaces that should have been impassable. It leaped over shell craters and wire entanglements as if they were mere inconveniences, and with each stride, the sound of its hoofbeats grew louder, more rhythmic, until it seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. "Stand to," Kovac shouted down into the trench. "Unknown rider approaching. All positions, prepare to receive." The men of the 3rd Sepulchre Regiment scrambled to their firing positions, bolt-action rifles sliding through the gaps in the sandbags, but their movements were sluggish, uncertain. After months of static warfare, the sudden appearance of a lone knight riding toward their lines seemed like something from a fever dream. The knight drew closer, and now they could hear the sound of his armor, a constant whisper of metal on metal that somehow cut through the rain and wind. The dragon scales on his breastplate pulsed faster, and with each pulse, they seemed to swell slightly, as if something were trying to push through from the inside. "Hail, brothers in arms." The knight's voice carried impossible distances, reaching every ear in the trench despite the weather. "I bring word from the shrine of the martyrs. St. George himself has blessed this endeavor." Kovac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The shrine of the martyrs had been overrun 6 months ago, its defenders martyred to the last man. No word had come from that sector since the final radio transmission, a garbled message about shadows moving in the catacombs beneath the altar. "Identify yourself," Kovac called back. The knight reined in his mount, just beyond the wire, close enough now that they could see the details of his armor with the naked eye. The metal was not steel, but something else, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The engravings covered every surface, depicting scenes of battle and martyrdom, but the figures seemed to move when observed directly, their poses shifting subtly when the viewer's attention wandered. "I am Sir Gareth of the Iron Lance," the knight replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Knight, commander of the Order of St. George, bearer of the dragon's flame, keeper of the sacred covenant." The titles meant nothing to Kovac. No such order appeared in any register he knew, and the knight's heraldry was unfamiliar. But there was something about the man's presence that made argument seem impossible. The rain had stopped falling directly around him, forming a perfect circle of dry ground beneath his horse's hooves. "The wounded cry out for succor," Sir Gareth continued, his lance sweeping toward the field hospital that had been established in the secondary trench. "I have come to ease their suffering." In the medical dugout, Brother Albertus looked up from the man he was tending. The soldier's leg had been nearly severed by shrapnel, and infection was already setting in despite the field medic's best efforts. The man's fevered rambling had been constant for hours, a litany of half-remembered prayers and pleas for death. "Did you hear that?" Albertus asked his assistant, a young novice named Peter who had joined the medical corps more from necessity than calling. "Hear what, brother?" "Someone speaking of the wounded." Peter paused in his work bandaging another soldier's arm. "I heard nothing but the rain, brother." But Albertus was already moving toward the entrance to the dugout, drawn by a compulsion he could not name. The wounded man on the table behind him let out a low moan, and for a moment, Albertus thought he heard something else in the sound, a harmony that spoke of things beyond human understanding. On the surface, Sir Gareth dismounted with fluid grace. His horse remained motionless, its eyes now glowing with the same inner fire as its rider's. The knight's boots left perfect impressions in the mud, but the footprints filled not with water but with something that glowed like molten metal. "Your hospitality is most welcome," Sir Gareth said, though no invitation had been offered. "The work of mercy cannot wait." Kovac wanted to protest, to demand proper identification and orders, but the words died in his throat. The knight's presence seemed to fill the air around him, making it difficult to think clearly. The dragon scales on his armor pulsed faster now, and in the dim light, Kovac could swear he saw tiny claws pressing against the metal from within. "The field hospital is this way," Kovac found himself saying, though he had not intended to speak. Sir Gareth nodded gravely. "Lead on, good sergeant. The night grows long, and there is much work to be done." As they made their way through the trench, the knight's armor continued its constant whisper. The sound seemed to seep into the very walls of the excavation, and more than one soldier paused in his duties to listen. The engravings on the armor were definitely moving now, the carved figures acting out their eternal dramas of conquest and sacrifice. The field hospital occupied a reinforced dugout that had once served as a command post. Canvas partitions divided the space into treatment areas, and the air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and wrong that no amount of disinfectant could mask. Brother Albertus stood at the entrance, his medical bag clutched in his hands. His face was pale, and his eyes held the glassy look of a man in the grip of religious ecstasy. "Sir Knight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have been waiting for you." Sir Gareth inclined his head. "As have they all, good brother. Show me the suffering." Albertus led them deeper into the dugout, past rows of wounded men lying on stretchers and makeshift beds. Some called out weakly for water or morphine, but most lay in silence, their eyes fixed on the knight's approaching figure. The dragon scales on his armor seemed to respond to their proximity, pulsing brighter and swelling visibly. "This one first," Sir Gareth said, stopping beside a soldier whose chest had been opened by machine gun fire. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, each breath accompanied by a wet gurgling sound. "He's beyond help," Albertus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No one is beyond help," Sir Gareth replied. "Not when St. George himself provides the means." The knight removed his gauntlets, revealing hands that were more metal than flesh. His fingers ended in claws that gleamed like polished silver, and as he reached toward the wounded man, the claws began to glow with heat. "What are you doing?" Kovac demanded, finally finding his voice. "Providing deliverance," Sir Gareth said simply. His claws pierced the wounded man's chest with surgical precision, sliding between the ribs as if they were made of butter. The soldier's eyes widened, but instead of pain, his expression showed only relief. A golden light began to emanate from the wounds, and the man's labored breathing eased. "The pain," the soldier whispered. "It's gone." Sir Gareth's claws moved deeper, and Kovac heard the sound of metal scraping against bone. The knight's face was serene behind his visor, and the dragon scales on his armor pulsed in rhythm with his movements. "Sleep now," Sir Gareth murmured. "Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." The soldier's breathing stopped, but the golden light continued to pour from his wounds. Sir Gareth's claws emerged, now holding something that looked like a fragment of bone, but it pulsed with its own inner fire. "Beautiful," Albertus breathed. "He's at peace." Sir Gareth placed the bone fragment into a small furnace that had somehow appeared at his feet, built into the armor of his greaves. The furnace door opened with a sound like distant thunder, revealing an interior that glowed with impossible heat. "The first offering," Sir Gareth said, closing the furnace, "the foundation stone of deliverance." He moved to the next wounded man, and then the next. Each time, his claws found their mark with perfect precision, and each time, the victim's face showed only gratitude as the life left their eyes. The bone fragments disappeared into the furnace, and with each addition, the dragon scales on his armor grew more agitated. Kovac watched in horror as the knight worked his way through the entire ward. The medical staff seemed entranced, offering no resistance as their patients were systematically murdered. Even the wounded themselves seemed eager for the knight's attention, reaching out with trembling hands as he approached their beds. "This is madness," Kovac muttered, but his voice was lost in the whisper of the knight's armor. The last wounded man was a young soldier who had lost both legs to a shell blast. He had been conscious throughout the night's work, watching with bright, feverish eyes as his comrades were granted their final peace. "My turn now," the soldier asked, his voice filled with desperate hope. "Indeed," Sir Gareth replied. "You have waited patiently." The claws descended once more, and the soldier's chest opened like a flower. But this time, Sir Gareth's movements were different, more deliberate. Instead of simply removing bone, he began to carve, his claws tracing intricate patterns in the dying man's ribs. "What are you doing?" Kovac demanded, finally breaking free of whatever spell had held him. "Creating a vessel," Sir Gareth replied without looking up, "the final piece of the puzzle." The soldier's ribcage had been transformed into something else, something that resembled a crude egg or cocoon. Sir Gareth lifted the entire structure from the man's chest, handling it with reverence despite the gore that dripped from its edges. "Now comes the true miracle," the knight said, carrying the bone construction to a clear area of the dugout floor. He knelt beside his makeshift altar, and the furnaces in his greaves opened. The bone fragments he had collected throughout the night poured out, not as ash, but as something molten and alive. The liquid bone flowed into the ribcage vessel, filling it completely. The dragon scales on Sir Gareth's armor were writhing now, bulging outward as if something were trying to escape. The knight reached up and began to unfasten the clasps that held his breastplate in place. "Behold," he said, his voice filled with religious fervor, "the children of St. George." The breastplate fell away, revealing a chest that was more machine than flesh. Where his ribs should have been, there were empty spaces, cavities that glowed with the same inner fire as his furnaces. And within those cavities, things were moving. "My God," Albertus whispered, "what have you done?" Sir Gareth smiled, and his face was terrible to behold. "I have prepared the way. The dragons must be born, and they must be fed." He reached into his own chest and withdrew something that squirmed and pulsed with malevolent life. It was small, no larger than a rat, but its form was unmistakably draconic. Tiny wings beat against the air, and its eyes glowed with the same fire as its creators. "The first of many," Sir Gareth said, placing the creature into the bone vessel. "But they are hungry, and they must grow strong." The thing in the vessel began to feed, and the sound it made was like grinding metal. The bone structure started to crack and splinter, unable to contain what was growing within. Sir Gareth stood, his armor once again complete. The dragon's scales on his breastplate were still now, but they had changed. Where before they had been merely trophies, now they were something else, something that lived and breathed and watched. "The night is not yet over," the knight said, looking directly at Kovac. "There are more wounded to tend, more offerings to be made." Kovac tried to run, but his legs would not obey him. The knight's gaze held him fast, and he could feel something crawling through his mind, searching for the parts of him that remained human. "You have seen the truth," Sir Gareth said, his voice now coming from everywhere at once. "You cannot unsee it. You cannot unhear the song." In the bone vessel, something roared. The knight's work was far from finished. Throughout the night, he moved through the trenches like a harvester, his claws finding new victims among the wounded and dying. But his methods grew more elaborate, more ritualistic. He began to arrange the bones in complex patterns, creating a network of vessels that pulsed with their own dark life. The dragon scales on his armor multiplied, spreading across his form like a living skin. Each scale contained something that moved and watched, a fragment of consciousness that had once been human but was now something else entirely. As dawn approached, the knight's true form began to reveal itself. The armor was not merely worn but grown, a carapace that had replaced his flesh over years of dark communion. The furnaces in his greaves had spread throughout his body, turning him into a walking factory of transformation. "The children are ready," he announced to the empty dugout. "The harvest is complete." The bone vessels cracked open simultaneously, and from each one emerged creatures that defied description. They were dragons, but dragons made of metal and malice, their wings forged from the dreams of the dying, and their breath composed of concentrated despair. Sir Gareth spread his arms wide, and the creatures came to him, settling into the spaces between his ribs like birds returning to their nests. His chest sealed itself, but the glow remained, and the whisper of metal on metal became a symphony of contained violence. "Now we ride," he said, mounting his patient steed. "The sepulchre lines have been blessed. The transformation can begin." As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Sir Gareth of the Iron Lance rode out of the trenches, his armor gleaming with unholy purpose. Behind him, the men of the 3rd Sepulchre Regiment began their own transformation, their flesh slowly giving way to metal as the dragon's gift took hold. The war would continue, but it would no longer be a war between men. It would be a war between what humanity had been and what it was becoming. A conflict that would reshape the very nature of flesh and spirit. And in the depths of his armored chest, the iron worms sang their song of endings and beginnings, their voices harmonizing with the eternal whisper of the knight's transformed form. The battlefield grew quiet as the last echoes of Sir Gareth's passing faded into the distance. But in the medical dugout, the blood-soaked earth began to pulse with a rhythm that matched the knight's heartbeat. The transformation had only just begun, and the true horror was yet to come. In the days that followed, the survivors of the 3rd Sepulchre Regiment would discover that death was no longer the end of their service. The bones that Sir Gareth had blessed continued to sing their metal song, calling to the living and the dead alike. The trenches themselves began to change, their walls hardening into something that resembled scales, and the wire entanglements took on the appearance of fossilized wings. The war machine had found a new purpose, and humanity would never be the same. The rain resumed its eternal fall, washing the blood from the dugout floor but unable to cleanse the stain that had been burned into the very fabric of reality. The sepulchre lines had been consecrated in iron and bone, and the dragon's hunger was far from satisfied. Sir Gareth's mission was complete, but his work had only just begun. Somewhere in the distance, other trenches waited for his blessing, other wounded cried out for his particular brand of mercy. The Order of St. George would grow, one transformed soul at a time, until the entire world rang with the song of iron and the whisper of scales. The knight's lance continued to drip its molten wax, each drop a promise of transformation, each hiss a hymn to the glory of the dragon's flame. And in the depths of his armor, the iron worms dreamed of the day when they would emerge to claim their inheritance, when the last human heart would be stilled and the age of dragons would begin. The battlefield slept, but it was not the sleep of peace. It was the sleep of metamorphosis, of change so fundamental that it would reshape the very meaning of existence. The war would continue, but it would no longer be fought with bullets and bayonets. It would be fought with bone and scale, with iron and flame, with the promise of transformation that Sir Gareth carried in his burning chest. The dragons were coming, and they would remake the world in their image. But first, they needed to grow. Brother Matthias had watched the entire spectacle from his position in the forward observation post, his eye pressed to the periscope until the lens fogged with his panicked breathing. When Sir Gareth finally departed, riding his unnatural mount back toward the enemy lines, Matthias remained frozen at his post for another hour, afraid to move lest he draw the attention of whatever forces had been unleashed in the dugout below. The silence that followed was worse than any bombardment. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to be born. Matthias could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, and beneath it, a new sound, a whisper that seemed to come from the very walls of the trench. When he finally descended from his observation post, he found the other survivors of his unit huddled around the entrance to the medical dugout. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with an expression that went beyond mere shock. They had the look of men who had seen their own deaths and found them wanting. "What do we do now?" asked Private Jensen, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining his sanity. Matthias had no answer. The protocols for dealing with enemy infiltration did not cover knights who murdered the wounded with surgical precision and fed their bones to furnaces hidden in their armor. The chain of command had become meaningless in the face of such impossible horror. "We report to headquarters," Matthias said finally, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "We tell them what we've seen." But even as he spoke, Matthias knew that no report would be filed. Who would believe such a story? Who would accept that a knight claiming to serve St. George had transformed their wounded into raw material for some unholy breeding program? The whisper from the dugout grew louder, and now Matthias could make out individual voices within the sound. They were the voices of the men who had died, but they were not crying out in pain or anguish. They were singing, their voices harmonizing in a melody that spoke of transformation and purpose. "Listen," Jensen whispered, his ear pressed to the dugout entrance. "They're still here. They're still with us." Matthias wanted to pull the private away, to order him to seal the entrance and forget what they had witnessed. But the song was beautiful in its own terrible way, and he found himself drawn to it despite his revulsion. The voices sang of iron and flame, of scales that grew like armor, and wings that carried the faithful to new realms of existence. They sang of a knight who had shown them the way to transcendence, who had freed them from the prison of flesh and bone. "He's coming back," Jensen said, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "Sir Gareth is coming back for us." Matthias looked toward the horizon, where the knight's figure was already visible as a dark speck against the gray sky. But Sir Gareth was not alone. Behind him rode a column of other knights, their armor gleaming with the same unholy light, their mounts breathing the same mechanical steam. The Order of St. George had come to claim the sepulchre lines, and they brought with them the promise of transformation for all who dwelt within the trenches. The war was about to change, and humanity would change with it. The whisper from the dugout became a roar. The approaching column of knights moved with the precision of a military formation, but there was something fundamentally wrong with their synchronization. They rode not as individual warriors, but as parts of a single organism, their movements coordinated by some intelligence that transcended human understanding. Sir Gareth led the procession, his lance now crowned with a flame that cast no shadows. The molten wax had been replaced by something else, something that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast heart. Behind him, the other knights bore weapons that defied conventional description, tools designed for harvesting rather than killing. Matthias counted 20 riders, but the number seemed to shift when he tried to focus on individual figures. Some of the knights appeared to be wearing armor that was still in the process of forming, plates of metal growing from their flesh like scales on a serpent. Others had advanced so far in their transformation that they were barely recognizable as human, their forms elongated and reptilian. "They're beautiful," Jensen whispered, his voice filled with religious awe. Matthias wanted to argue, to point out the horror of what they were witnessing, but he found that his own perspective was beginning to shift. The knights did possess a certain terrible beauty, a perfection of form that spoke to something deep within the human soul. They had transcended the limitations of flesh and bone, becoming something greater than mere mortality. The column drew closer, and now Matthias could see that the knights' mounts were not horses at all. They were dragons, or at least things that had once been dragons, their forms mechanical and precise. Steam rose from their nostrils, and their eyes glowed with the same inner fire as their riders. "Prepare to receive the blessing," Sir Gareth called out, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity. "The transformation cannot be stopped, but it can be embraced." The surviving members of the 3rd Sepulchre Regiment emerged from their positions, drawn by a compulsion that overrode their instincts for self-preservation. They moved like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with anticipation. Matthias tried to resist, to maintain some fragment of his humanity, but the song from the dugout was growing stronger. The voices of the dead were calling to him, promising release from the burden of mortal existence. The knights' armor gleamed with hypnotic patterns, and their weapons hummed with barely contained energy. "Join us," Jensen said, his hand extended toward Matthias. "Join us in the glory of transformation." Matthias looked at the private's face and saw that it was already changing. Jensen's skin had taken on a metallic sheen, and his eyes reflected light like polished mirrors. Scales were beginning to form along his jawline, and his teeth had become sharp and gleaming. The transformation was not limited to the dead. It was spreading through the living as well, a contagion that rewrote the very essence of its victims. Matthias could feel it working within his own body, a warmth that spread through his veins and settled in his bones. "No," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sir Gareth dismounted from his draconic steed and approached the gathered soldiers. His armor had continued to evolve, spreading across his form like a living thing. The dragon scales on his breastplate had multiplied and spread, covering his arms and legs in a pattern that seemed to shift and flow with each movement. "You have witnessed the first miracle," the knight said, his voice now coming from multiple sources at once. "The wounded have been transformed, their suffering made purposeful. Now comes the second miracle, the blessing of the living." He raised his lance, and the flame at its tip flared brighter. The light washed over the assembled soldiers, and Matthias felt the transformation accelerate. His skin began to harden, taking on the texture of metal, and his bones grew dense and heavy. "Feel the dragon's gift," Sir Gareth continued. "Feel the strength that comes with transcendence." Matthias tried to scream, but the sound that emerged from his throat was not human. It was a roar that spoke of ancient power and terrible purpose. His body was changing, stretching and reshaping itself according to some alien blueprint. The other soldiers were undergoing similar transformations, their forms becoming more reptilian with each passing moment. But instead of horror, their faces showed only joy and wonder. They had found their true purpose, their reason for existence. "The war continues," Sir Gareth announced as the transformation reached its climax. "But now we fight not as men but as dragons. We fight not for territory but for the glory of transformation itself." The newly transformed soldiers spread their wings, testing their strength and flexibility. They had become something new, something that transcended the limitations of human existence. The war would continue, but it would be fought on different terms, with different weapons, for different goals. Sir Gareth remounted his steed, his lance gleaming with renewed purpose. The Order of St. George was growing, adding new members with each battlefield they blessed. Soon, the entire front would be transformed, and the war would become something entirely new. The dragons took to the sky, their wings beating with mechanical precision. They soared above the trenches, above the killing fields, above the petty concerns of mortal conflict. They were the future, and the future was bright with the promise of transformation. Below, the empty trenches began to fill with something new. The earth itself was changing, taking on the characteristics of dragon scales. The wire entanglements grew into skeletal wings, and the gun emplacements became nesting sites for the iron worms that would soon emerge from the depths of the earth. The war machine had found its true purpose, and humanity would never be the same. The battlefield was quiet now, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of metamorphosis, of change so fundamental that it would reshape the very meaning of existence. The dragons were coming, and they would remake the world in their image. But first, they needed to multiply. In the depths of the transformed trenches, the iron worms sang their song of endings and beginnings, their voices harmonizing with the eternal whisper of scales on metal. The war would continue, but it would no longer be a war between nations or ideologies. It would be a war between what humanity had been and what it was becoming, a conflict that would determine the future of existence itself. The dragons were patient, and they were hungry. They would wait as long as necessary for their feast to ripen, for their transformation to reach its final stage. And when that time came, the world would burn with the fire of their birth, and from the ashes would rise something new and terrible and beautiful. The knight's work was complete, but his mission would continue forever. There would always be new trenches to bless, new wounded to transform, new souls to guide toward transcendence. The Order of St. George would grow until it encompassed the entire world, and every heart would beat with the rhythm of dragons' wings. The rain continued to fall, but it was no longer water that fell from the sky. It was the tears of the dying world, weeping for what it had lost and what it had become. The tears were red with blood and black with ash, and they tasted of iron and flame and the promise of transformation. The war would never end, but it would never be the same. The dragons had come to claim their inheritance, and they would not be denied. The silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of scales and the distant sound of wings. The world was changing, and there was no going back. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, a new age, a new form of existence that would redefine what it meant to be alive. The dragons were coming, and they would not be stopped. The war continued, but it was no longer a human war. It was something else entirely, something that would reshape the very fabric of reality itself. And in the depths of the earth, the iron worms sang their song of endings and beginnings, their voices rising to join the eternal chorus of transformation that echoed across the battlefields of the world. The knight's work was done, but his legacy would endure forever. The Order of St. George would grow and spread, carrying the gift of transformation to every corner of the world. And when the last human heart had been stilled and the last human breath had been drawn, the dragons would inherit the earth, and the age of scales would begin. The war would continue, but it would be fought with claws and teeth and fire, with the tools of dragons rather than the weapons of men. And in the end, when the last battle had been fought and the last victory had been won, the dragons would look upon their domain and see that it was good. The transformation was complete, but the story was eternal. It would be told and retold, passed down through generations of dragons, a tale of the time when the world was remade in iron and flame. And the knight's lance would continue to drip its molten promise, each drop a seed of change, each hiss a herald of the glory that was to come. The war would never end, but it would never be the same. The dragons were coming, and they would remake the world in their image. But first, they needed to feed. The cycle would continue, eternal and unchanging, a dance of transformation that would echo through the ages. The war would go on, but it would be fought on different terms, with different weapons, for different purposes. And in the end, when all was said and done, the dragons would rule, and the world would be remade in their image. The knight's work was complete, but his mission would continue forever. The war would never end. The dragons were coming, and they would not be denied. The days following the transformation blurred together in a haze of unnatural purpose. The former soldiers of the 3rd Sepulchre Regiment no longer required sleep or sustenance in any conventional sense. They drew their energy from the molten cores that had replaced their hearts, and their dreams were filled with visions of conquest and metamorphosis. Brother Matthias, now more dragon than man, found himself appointed as a herald of the new order. His transformed vocal cords could produce sounds that reached frequencies beyond human hearing, allowing him to communicate with the iron worms that had begun to emerge from the depths of the earth. The creatures were still small, no larger than house cats, but they grew with each passing hour. They fed on the metallic essence that now permeated the soil, drawing sustenance from the very foundations of the transformed battlefield. Their scales were mirror bright, reflecting not light but the deepest desires of those who looked upon them. Sir Gareth had established his command post in what had once been the regiment's chapel, though the space had been transformed beyond recognition. The altar had been replaced by a forge that burned with no fuel save the will of its creator, and the pews had been reshaped into nesting sites for the growing brood of iron worms. The transformation proceeds ahead of schedule. The knight reported to his unseen superiors, his voice carrying through dimensions that had no names. The local ecosystem has adapted to our presence with remarkable efficiency. The response came not as words, but as a sensation that filled the air with the taste of copper and the smell of ozone. The hierarchy of the Order of St. George existed on levels that transcended physical reality, and communication with the higher echelons required senses that had no human equivalent. Sir Gareth's armor had continued to evolve, spreading across his form like a living thing. The dragon scales that covered his body were no longer mere decoration but functional organs, each one containing a fragment of consciousness that had been harvested from the dying. They watched and listened and remembered, building a collective awareness that grew stronger with each passing moment. The knight's lance had undergone its own transformation, becoming less a weapon than a focusing tool for the energies that flowed through his transformed body. The molten wax that had once crowned its tip had been replaced by something that defied description, a substance that existed in multiple states simultaneously. The iron worms had begun to sing. Their voices were barely audible at first, a subsonic rumble that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. But as their numbers grew, so did the volume and complexity of their song. It was a melody that spoke of ancient hungers and patient appetites, of transformations that spanned not days or months but geological epochs. Brother Matthias found himself drawn to the largest of the creatures, a magnificent specimen that had grown to the size of a small horse. Its scales reflected not the present but possible futures, showing glimpses of a world where the transformation had reached its ultimate conclusion. In those reflections, he saw cities of living metal, forests of crystallized bone, and skies filled with creatures that had never been human. The children grow restless, Sir Gareth observed, his voice now a harmony of multiple tones. They sensed the approaching convergence. The convergence was a concept that had been burned into the consciousness of every transformed soul. It was the moment when the iron worms would achieve critical mass, when their collective will would overcome the last barriers between dimensions. The war would end not with victory or defeat, but with the simple obsolescence of all human conflict. In the distance, the sounds of conventional warfare continued. Artillery shells fell like rain, and machine guns chattered their mechanical prayers. But the noises seemed muffled now, as if they were coming from another world entirely. The transformed soldiers paid them no attention, their awareness focused on frequencies that no human ear could detect. The iron worms were migrating. They moved not across the surface of the earth but through dimensions of space that existed perpendicular to normal reality. Their passage left traces in the air, shimmering distortions that revealed glimpses of other battlefields, other wars, other transformations taking place across the infinite expanse of possibility. Brother Matthias watched them go with something that might have been nostalgia, if dragons were capable of such human emotions. The creatures that had hatched from the bones of his former comrades were seeking their own destinies, carrying the gift of transformation to realms that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. "They will return," Sir Gareth said, though whether he spoke of the iron worms or something else entirely was unclear. "When the time is right, they will return to claim their inheritance." The knight's armor had achieved its final form, a carapace that encompassed not just his body, but his very essence. He was no longer Sir Gareth of the Iron Lance, but something else, something that had no name in any human language. He was the avatar of transformation itself, the living embodiment of change that transcended all boundaries. The chapel forge burned brighter, its flames now visible across multiple spectrums of reality. The fire was not consuming fuel but creating it, drawing energy from the quantum foam that underlaid all existence. Each spark that rose from its depths carried the potential for new forms of life, new expressions of consciousness that would reshape the very meaning of identity. Brother Matthias felt the change beginning within himself once more. The transformation was not a single event, but a process, an ongoing evolution that would continue for eternity. His scales were beginning to shed, revealing something beneath that was not flesh but pure possibility. "The war ends," he said, though the words came out as a roar that shattered the remaining windows in the chapel. "The war begins," Sir Gareth corrected, his voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The contradiction was not paradox, but truth. The conflict between nations and ideologies was indeed ending, but in its place would rise something far more fundamental. The war between what was and what could be, between the limitations of existing reality and the infinite potential of transformation. The iron worms had left their marks in the air, and through those marks, other things were beginning to emerge. They were not dragons, but the shadows of dragons, the echoes of transformations that had taken place in dimensions where time flowed backward and causality had no meaning. Brother Matthias felt his consciousness expanding, spreading across multiple planes of existence simultaneously. He was still in the chapel, still kneeling before the forge, but he was also soaring through cosmic voids where stars were born from the dreams of dying gods. He was witnessing the birth of new realities, new forms of existence that would replace the tired old world of flesh and blood. The transformation was accelerating. Sir Gareth's form began to blur, his edges becoming indistinct as he shifted between states of being. The armor that had once contained him was now part of the fabric of reality itself, woven into the quantum structure of space and time. He was becoming something that existed in all places and all times simultaneously, a constant of transformation that would persist long after the last star had burned out. "Do you understand now?" the knight asked, though his voice was now the sound of galaxies colliding. "Do you see what we have accomplished?" Brother Matthias did see, and the vision filled him with an ecstasy that transcended all human emotion. They had not merely transformed themselves, but had become agents of cosmic evolution, catalysts for changes that would ripple across the entire universe. The war in the trenches had been only the beginning, the first spark of a conflagration that would consume all existence and birth something unimaginably greater. The chapel was dissolving around them, its walls becoming transparent as reality itself began to thin. Through the gaps, Brother Matthias could see other worlds, other versions of the same transformation playing out across infinite variations of possibility. In some, the change had taken different forms. In others, it had not yet begun. But in all of them, the same fundamental force was at work, the same irresistible drive toward transcendence. The iron worms were returning. They came not from the depths of the earth, but from the depths of space itself, their forms now grown beyond all recognition. They were planets and stars and galaxies, entire cosmic structures that had achieved consciousness and purpose. They sang as they came, their voices harmonizing in a symphony that rewrote the laws of physics with each note. Sir Gareth raised his lance one final time, and the substance at its tip flared with a light that existed in colors that had no names. The light washed over everything, transforming not just matter but the very concepts that gave matter meaning. Reality became fluid, malleable, subject to the will of those who understood its true nature. "The harvest is complete," the knight declared, his words becoming fundamental forces that shape the structure of existence itself. "The transformation is eternal." Brother Matthias felt himself dissolving, his consciousness merging with the cosmic symphony that filled all space and time. He was no longer an individual but part of something greater, a note in a song that would play forever across the infinite expanse of transformed reality. The war was over. The war had never begun. The war would continue forever. All were true, all were false, all were meaningless in the face of the transformation that had consumed everything and created nothing and changed all possibilities into certainties. The iron worms sang their song of endings and beginnings, and their voices were the sound of reality itself breathing in the rhythm of eternal change. The trenches were gone, the soldiers were gone, the war was gone, but the transformation remained, spreading across dimensions that existed beyond the boundaries of thought or imagination. Sir Gareth's armor gleamed with the light of dying stars, and in its reflection, new universes were born from the dreams of dragons who had once been human. The cycle continued, eternal and unchanging, a dance of transformation that would echo through the ages until the last possibility had been explored and the final change had been made. The knight rode on, his mission complete but never ending, carrying the gift of transformation to realms that existed beyond the boundaries of existence itself. His lance continued to drip its molten promise, each drop a seed of change that would grow into realities that defied all comprehension. The war would never end, but it would never be the same. The dragons were coming, and they had always been here. The transformation was complete, but it had only just begun. And in the silence, between moments, between thoughts, between the beats of cosmic hearts, the iron worms sang their eternal song of what was, and what would be, and what could never be, but always was. The knight's work continued, spreading across infinite dimensions, carrying the blessing of transformation to every corner of existence. There would always be new trenches to bless, new wounded to transform, new souls to guide toward transcendence. The war was everything and nothing, beginning and end, the eternal dance of change that defined the very nature of reality itself. And somewhere, in a dimension that existed perpendicular to thought, a lone knight clad in relic steel rode toward lines that had not yet been drawn, promising deliverance to soldiers who had not yet been born. His lance dripping with the molten essence of transformation that would remake them all in the image of dragons. The cycle turned, eternal and inescapable, and the song of the iron worms grew louder with each passing moment, filling the void between possibilities with the promise of change that would never end.